Roger Mark started with a farmer in Ethiopia focusing on climate and adaptation. I'll focus on climate and adaptation, but start in a very different place, a very different locale, which is in Washington, D.C. And in 1994, we at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is literally the formal memorial to Wilson, a kind of a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum to bring the worlds of scholarship and policy together. Wilson happened to be our only president to have a PhD, so Congress thought it appropriate to set up a living memorial where these two worlds could learn from one another. And so in 1994, kind of in the wake of the Cold War, there was a struggle, a search for how issues of environment, climate, population, broader development concerns did or did not fit into broader foreign policy and security policy contexts. And unfortunately, 17 years later, at least in fora like Rio+20, we're still searching for finding ways to understand these issues together and respond to them together. And I would submit that is as well a missed opportunity, because in those intervening years, there actually has been a lot of progress that hasn't been easy, and it's really required a fundamental willingness on very different communities that have very different tools and often very different objectives. If we're talking about an environment community on the one side, a security community on the other, it requires the dropping down of the guard to avoid stereotypes, to actually educate oneself about those other communities, their tools, their advantages, their disadvantages, and understand where there are overlaps. And we have found that there are an awful lot of overlaps in very different sectors, whether it's the critical dependence of literally billions of the world's population on natural resources for their very existence. And in that frame, a human security, a wider notion of security is deemed kind of very appropriate for understanding how important these issues are, right? They're not, as is unfortunately often the case, dismissed as something that once you get rich and democratic, then you can care about the environment. In fact, these are life and death issues. At the same time, in part when some of those insecurities at the individual or community level aggregate, they can actually pose larger challenges and be part of a mix if we're interested in issues of social conflict or even larger violent conflict and social stability of states, that this is also an appropriate area for discussion, that if we don't understand these worlds together and have conversations together, then we miss some very important dynamics. And so I want to give one example of perhaps where in a forum like Rio+20, if we were more willing to have these conversations and not, as Roger Mark suggested in the population realm, we just don't talk about it, that there would actually be, if we come down from the boardrooms and the global perspective of the multilateral environmental agreements, some real opportunities. And so, for example, focus on adaptation. We have many of those places that Roger Mark highlighted are as heavily susceptible to climate change with the low ability, the high vulnerability, low capacity to respond. They're not resilient on multiple kind of political levels in responding to that, institutionally or environmentally. And so if one is doing climate adaptation in some of those developing country contexts, key to making progress is strengthening some of those governance institutions, some of those political institutions, to essentially take these additional stresses that will come with climate change and find ways to cope and find ways to adapt, frankly. Now, it turns out that if you have a development agenda, or if you have a peace building, whether you're trying to prevent conflict or you're coming out of a conflict, you're a fragile state, it turns out that many of those same institutions are the ones that you want to address, the ones that you want to strengthen to try to either avoid conflict, to get yourself out of conflict, or to build peace in a post-conflict setting. Unfortunately, those communities have their different acronym soups, and they don't know each other. They have, in some cases, rightful mutual suspicions, but nevertheless ones that need to be gotten over. And unfortunately, these conversations aren't going on. In a few places, we can see that it's making a difference. So International Alert, which is a humanitarian and peace-building NGO based in London, is working in West Africa in countries that there's a high expectation that climate change is going to put additional stress on those areas, particularly in the area of water. And so their development and humanitarian work has very explicitly the understanding that this could be part of a larger peace building or conflict context. And the way they're designing their climate adaptation interventions are integrated and inseparable from a peace building and conflict prevention. In Peru, where there's great concern about the loss of glaciers and the seasonal melt that provides, really is the reservoir, the water tower for many in that country, those who are getting ahead of this issue and trying to anticipate that water stress in the future are doing that because of what it means for livelihoods, but also because what it may mean for larger questions of societal stability. And so that integrated thinking are where we have some real opportunities to do it. I'll end by saying that at minimum, if we want to capture those opportunities, but at minimum, we need to avoid, as we address climate change, we need to avoid creating problems and doing harm. So from the field of medicine, we need to do no harm with our interventions. And so what do I mean by that? I think, for example, the biofuels experience, which at least nominally was a part of that to move away from fossil fuels, is one where we have a fair bit of evidence that in areas remote to where they're being grown or used, it's having deleterious effects and in fact causing social conflict. And so while the Europeans may adopt a target in their renewables for transportation, it's the accelerated deforestation and social conflict in the sourcing countries in Asia that are growing that palm oil, having that palm oil price double from one year to the next, and creating conflict in those settings. If we are, and I'll use an acronym but define it, if we're going to be serious about paying for ecosystem services in our RED schemes, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, that's a commendable direction, right? Finding ways to put value on those forests to keep them standing so they can be a carbon sink and help us address climate change. But we're talking about changing land use, access, and patterns, and we're introducing money into a system. That can be done well, and that can be done poorly in a way that could actually cause conflict. And so we need, so it's really just a plea that we go into these issues with our eyes open, and they will be truly open if we find ways to bridge the communities of climate and environment, development, peace building, and security.